The wind screamed across the Wyoming prairie as a young widow pulled her 3 children close beneath a torn canvas shelter that could barely stand against the weather. One hand held a rusted revolver while the other wrapped protectively around her youngest daughter, whose cries had become weaker with each passing day. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear had followed the family for months. And tonight, the approaching storm threatened to take away the little they had left. The dark clouds, rolling across the plains, looked like an army marching toward them, and the widow knew their fragile shelter would never survive what was coming. Before this unforgettable Western story begins, welcome to Legend of West, where powerful tales of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected love come alive. If stories like this touch your heart, make sure to subscribe and join our growing family, because every new story brings another journey through the untamed American frontier. 3 months earlier, life had looked very different. The widow and her husband had traveled west with dreams larger than the endless Wyoming sky. They planned to build a ranch, raise cattle, and create a future where their children would never know hardship. Her husband was a hard-working man with strong hands and an even stronger spirit. He believed that determination could overcome any obstacle. Unfortunately, the frontier had other plans. Only weeks after arriving, sudden fever struck him without warning. At first he insisted it was nothing serious, but within days he was too weak to stand. The local doctor tried everything he knew, but medicine in the Wyoming territory was limited and unreliable. The widow spent sleepless nights cooling her husband's forehead and praying for a miracle that never came. One quiet afternoon, he closed his eyes for the final time, leaving her alone with 3 children and a future that suddenly seemed impossible. The wagon was sold to pay for the burial. The family's savings disappeared within weeks. Their land claim expired because she could not afford the required improvements. One by one, every valuable possession vanished. Extra clothing, cooking supplies, tools, furniture, and finally even her wedding ring were traded away for food. Each trade felt like losing another piece of her past life. Soon there was nothing left except a few blankets, a small cooking pot, and the old revolver that had belonged to her husband. The widow fought every day to keep her children alive. Her oldest daughter had once been cheerful and carefree, but hardship had forced the little girl to grow up too quickly. At only 8 years old, she worried about food, weather, and survival. Her faded dress had been patched so many times that hardly any original fabric remained. Her younger brother, a 5-year-old boy with bright eyes and endless imagination, spent his days drawing shapes in the dirt and pretending sticks were horses. He rarely asked when they would have a home again, because he had already learned that some questions only caused pain. The youngest child was barely 3 years old. She was small, fragile, and often too weak to play. Every time the widow looked at her daughter, she felt a wave of fear. The child needed proper meals, warm shelter, and safety. Yet her mother could barely provide any of those things. Work was nearly impossible to find. The town offered few opportunities for women, especially women, burdened with 3 children. She washed clothes beside the river when she could. She cleaned barns occasionally. Sometimes kind townspeople gave her a few coins. More often, they simply looked away. Pride had long since stopped mattering. Survival was all that remained. As evening settled over the prairie, the widow watched the western sky darken. The approaching storm looked dangerous, even by Wyoming standards. Strong winds swept across the open land, shaking the shelter with increasing violence. The canvas snapped loudly overhead. Loose ropes whipped through the air. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Her oldest daughter moved closer. "Mama, is the storm coming here?" the girl asked quietly. The widow forced a smile she did not feel. "We'll be all right," she answered, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. Another gust of wind slammed into the shelter. The entire structure trembled. Dust filled the air. The little boy abandoned his game and hurried toward his family. The youngest child began crying again. The widow looked at the darkening horizon and felt fear tightening around her heart. They had survived hunger. They had survived grief. But tonight they might not survive the weather. Then she heard something unexpected. Hoofbeats. Slow and steady, at first, then growing louder. Instantly, her hand found the revolver. She stood and positioned herself between the approaching sound and her children. Out on the prairie, a lone rider emerged from the gathering darkness. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the stranger. He sat tall in the saddle of a strong sorrel horse and moved with the confidence of a man completely at home on the frontier. The widow's pulse quickened. A woman alone with children could not afford trust. The rider continued approaching until he was close enough to see the damaged shelter. Finally, he stopped and raised one hand peacefully. The wind roared around them as thunder rolled overhead. The widow lifted the revolver slightly and called, "Out." "That's close enough. State your business." The stranger studied the scene before him. The frightened children, the collapsing shelter, the exhausted woman standing bravely in front of her family. Then he spoke with a calm voice that somehow carried through the storm. "Ma'am," he said, "you and those children can't stay out here tonight." The widow tightened her grip on the revolver as another flash of lightning split the sky. She had never seen this cowboy before. She had no reason to trust him, yet something in his voice made her hesitate. What happened next would change the course of her life forever. The widow stared at the stranger through the growing darkness while the wind whipped her hair across her face. Every instinct told her to protect her children and trust no one. Yet the approaching storm made that decision harder with every passing second. Thunder shook the prairie again, louder this time, and the cowboy slowly removed his hat so she could see his face clearly. He appeared to be in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of hard work. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no dangerous smile, and no sign of the intentions she had learned to fear. Instead, he looked genuinely concerned. "My name is Ethan Walker," he said calmly. "I work at Silver Creek Ranch about 5 miles east of here. I was riding back from town when I saw your camp. This storm is worse than it looks. That shelter won't survive the night." The widow kept the revolver raised. "And why should that concern you?" Ethan glanced toward the frightened children before answering. "Because no child deserves to face a storm like this out in the open." Before she could reply, a violent gust slammed into the canvas shelter. One of the support ropes snapped instantly. The torn fabric flapped wildly as another section ripped apart. The youngest child cried louder and buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Ethan watched the damage and shook his head. "You've got maybe 15 minutes before this storm reaches full strength." The widow looked toward the sky. Rain was already beginning to fall. Deep inside, she knew he was right. Their shelter was finished. If the storm became any stronger, they would be left completely exposed. Pride urged her to refuse help. Pride had carried her through months of humiliation and hardship. Pride reminded her that accepting favors often came with hidden costs. But then she looked at her children. They were cold, hungry, frightened, and exhausted. Pride could not keep them safe tonight. "What exactly are you offering?" she finally asked. Ethan nodded toward the east. "There's an empty ranch cabin not far from here. It's small but solid. Stone chimney, wooden walls, strong roof. You and the children can stay there until the storm passes." Her eyes narrowed immediately. "And what do you expect in return?" For a brief moment, disappointment crossed his face. Then he answered honestly, "Nothing." She almost laughed. Nothing was a word she no longer believed. Nothing did not exist on the frontier. Every favor had a price. Every kindness carried expectations. Yet Ethan simply stood there waiting. "I don't know. You," she said quietly. "That's true," he replied. "But I know a storm when I see one. And I know those children won't survive a night out here." A bright flash of lightning exploded across the sky. Almost instantly, a deafening crack of thunder followed. The little boy jumped and grabbed his mother's arm. Rain began falling harder. Ethan looked at the clouds and made his decision. "You don't have time to think much longer. The widow looked down at her children. Fear filled their faces. She realized that refusing now would not be courage. It would be stubbornness. "All right," she said finally. "Just for tonight." Ethan immediately sprang into action. "Gather whatever you need. Only essentials. We have to move now." The family rushed toward the shelter. The oldest daughter grabbed blankets while the little boy collected their small bag of belongings. The widow stepped inside to retrieve a wooden box containing the few precious memories she still possessed. Before she could reach it, disaster struck. A powerful blast of wind tore through the camp. The main support pole snapped in half with a sharp crack. The entire shelter collapsed instantly. Canvas, ropes, and broken wood flew through the air. The widow stumbled backward as everything they owned disappeared beneath the wreckage. The children screamed. Rain poured down harder than ever. For a moment she stood frozen. Their home, such as it was, had vanished within seconds. Ethan moved quickly. "Forget the shelter," he shouted above the storm. "The children come first." He lifted the youngest girl into his arms and carried her toward his horse. The animal remained calm despite the chaos. The little boy was carefully placed behind the saddle. The oldest daughter climbed up behind her brother. The widow hesitated only briefly before following. Within moments, all of them were mounted. Ethan settled into the saddle behind them and secured the reins. "Hold on tight," he warned. Then they rode directly into the storm. Rain hammered them from every direction. Wind roared across the prairie. Lightning flashed repeatedly, turning night into day for brief, terrifying moments. The widow wrapped her arms around her children and prayed silently. Every bump felt dangerous. Every thunderclap shook her nerves. Yet through it all, Ethan guided the horse with remarkable confidence. He seemed to know every hill, every trail, every hidden danger despite the darkness. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then through the curtain of rain, a shape appeared ahead. It was a cabin, small, sturdy, and solid. Warm light glowed from a lantern hanging beside the door. Relief flooded through the widow so suddenly she nearly cried. Ethan guided the horse to the entrance and quickly helped everyone down. The children rushed toward the porch while rain poured around them. Ethan opened the door and warm air immediately drifted outside. The widow stepped across the threshold and stopped. A stone fireplace stood against one wall. A wooden table occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined another wall and several oil lamps illuminated the space with soft golden light. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't grand. But after months of sleeping on dirt, it felt like a palace. The youngest child stared at the fireplace with wide eyes. The little boy touched the wooden floor as if he couldn't believe it was real. The oldest daughter simply stood there speechless. Ethan quietly closed the door behind them as the storm raged outside. Then he placed a small bundle on the table. The smell instantly filled the room. Fresh bread, smoked meat, and dried apples. The children's eyes grew huge. They had not seen so much food in months. The widow looked at the cowboy in disbelief. Ethan offered a small smile. "I figured you might be hungry." The children moved toward the table, but they looked at their mother first, waiting for permission. She nodded slowly. Within seconds, they were eating. Watching them devour the meal nearly broke her heart. Ethan remained silent, pretending not to notice the tears gathering in her eyes. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, for the first time in months, the widow and her children were warm, dry, and safe. Yet she still knew almost nothing about the cowboy who had rescued them. And before the night was over, she would discover that Ethan Walker carried painful secrets of his own. The storm continued pounding the cabin throughout the night, rattling the windows and sending waves of rain against the wooden walls. Yet inside, warmth filled every corner of the small room. The children had eaten until they could eat no more. For the first time in months, their stomachs were full. The youngest daughter had fallen asleep beside the fireplace with a blanket wrapped around her tiny body. Her brother rested nearby, holding a piece of bread in one hand as if he feared it might disappear before morning. The oldest daughter sat quietly at the table, fighting sleep, but unwilling to close her eyes. Everything felt too good to be real. The widow watched her children and felt a peace she had almost forgotten existed. Ethan sat across the room repairing a leather saddle strap. He worked silently, giving the family space and never making them feel uncomfortable. The longer she observed him, the more confused she became. During the past 3 months, she had met many men. Some had offered pity, others had offered insults. A few had offered help with conditions attached. Ethan was different. He expected nothing. He demanded nothing. He simply helped. Finally, she broke the silence. Why? Ethan looked up. Why what? Why stop for strangers? She asked. Most people rode past our camp without even slowing down. Ethan stared at the fireplace for several seconds before answering. Because once somebody stopped for me. The widow remained quiet, sensing there was more. Ethan set the saddle strap aside and leaned back in his chair. 6 years ago, I had a wife and a son. The words immediately caught her attention. We lived in Montana, had a small ranch. Nothing special, but it was ours. His voice grew softer. Then sickness came through our town. My wife died first. My boy followed 3 days later. The room fell silent. The widow felt her chest tighten. She knew that pain. She knew the emptiness left behind when someone you loved disappeared forever. Ethan continued staring into the fire. After that, I stopped caring about much of anything. Sold the ranch, left everything behind, drifted from one cattle drive to another. He forced a small smile. Then one winter storm nearly killed me. My horse went lame. I got lost in the mountains. If an old rancher hadn't found me and brought me home, I wouldn't be sitting here today. He looked directly at her. That old man saved my life. He never asked for payment. He just said that if I ever got the chance, I should help someone else. The widow lowered her eyes. Suddenly, Ethan's kindness made sense. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was gratitude. The conversation ended there, but something had changed between them. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt comfortable speaking to another man. Morning arrived with clear blue skies. The storm had passed. Sunlight poured through the cabin, windows. The children woke smiling. The youngest girl laughed while chasing dust particles dancing in the sunlight. Her brother explored every corner of the cabin as if it were a castle. Even the oldest daughter seemed lighter than before. The family prepared to leave, Ethan stepped outside and saddled his horse. The widow joined him on the porch. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for last night, for everything. Ethan nodded. You're welcome. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. Actually, there is something I'd like to ask. Her guard immediately rose. Ethan noticed and smiled gently. It's not what you're thinking. He pointed toward the distant ranch buildings visible on the horizon. Silver Creek Ranch needs a cook. The previous cook left last month. The owner has been searching for someone reliable. The widow stared at him in surprise. Ethan continued. The job comes with a small cabin. Nothing fancy, but it's clean. Your children would have a roof over their heads and regular meals. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. You're serious? Completely serious. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. 3 months of fear, 3 months of uncertainty, 3 months of watching her children suffer. Suddenly a door was opening. Not charity, not a handout, honest work, a chance to rebuild. The oldest daughter stepped onto the porch. Mama? She asked. The widow looked at her children. Then she looked at Ethan. When do we start? Ethan's smile was the first truly happy smile she had seen from him. Today. Within hours they arrived at Silver Creek Ranch. The ranch owner welcomed them warmly after hearing their story. By sunset, the family had moved into a small but comfortable cabin. It wasn't large, but it was theirs. The children had beds. There was food in the kitchen. And for the first time in many months, the future looked bright. Weeks turned into months. The widow became an important part of the ranch. Everyone respected her hard work and determination. The children thrived. Their cheeks grew healthier. Their laughter returned. Slowly, the shadows of the past began to fade. Throughout it all, Ethan remained close. He fixed broken fences, taught the little boy how to ride horses, carried firewood to the cabin during winter, and always found reasons to stop by. Friendship grew naturally between them. Friendship slowly became trust. Trust slowly became something deeper. One spring evening, nearly a year after the storm, Ethan stood beside her beneath a sky painted gold by the setting sun. "You know," he said quietly, "the night I found that tent, I thought I was saving a family." The widow smiled. "And?" Ethan reached for her hand. "Turns out you saved me too." Tears filled her eyes as she squeezed his hand. Sometimes the frontier took everything from a person. Sometimes it left nothing behind except grief and memories. But every now and then, when hope seemed completely lost, life offered a second chance. For one widow, 3 children, and a lonely cowboy, that second chance arrived during a storm on the Wyoming prairie. And from that night forward, none of their lives were ever the same again. Thank you for listening to this story on Legend of West. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe because another unforgettable Western adventure is waiting for you in the next story.